A jury in New York finding Donald Trump, the Republican presidential frontrunner by far, liable for sexually abusing and defaming writer E. Jean Carroll. The jury also awarding the former magazine columnist nearly $5 million in damages to be paid by Mr. Trump. Carroll walked out of the Manhattan courthouse just moments ago with her lawyer, who said that they are, quote, very happy with the jury's decision. Carroll's lawsuit stemmed from an encounter between her and Trump in a New York department store dressing room in 1996, Bergdorf Goodman's, where she claims Donald Trump sexually assaulted her. Donald Trump just reacted on his social media platform, writing in all caps, quote, "I have absolutely no idea who this woman is. This verdict is a disgrace, a continuation of the greatest witch hunt of all time," unquote. This all comes as Trump is facing.
Hey guys, welcome back. Dr. John is here. Every thread has been pulling toward the same question. What happens if Congress actually follows through? The war powers votes fell short by razor-thin margins. Leadership kept canceling floor votes to run out the clock. But at some point, Johnson runs out of calendar pages. The vote happens. The 7 members who've been sitting on the fence have seen enough.
Another very serious case in New York City. Just last month, the former president pleaded not guilty to 34 felony charges related to hush money payments to adult film star and director Stormy Daniels. Not to mention investigations by the Justice Department into January 6th and to those classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, not to mention the investigation by prosecutors in Fulton County, Georgia, who are looking into his attempt to flip Georgia, perhaps illegally, in the 2020 election. But let's go back to the first verdict. Let's get right to CNN's Kara Scannell outside the courthouse in New York. And Kara, this was pretty quick, and it was also, I think it was more money than she was originally asking for.
Another court ruling, another ally walking away, another $200 billion price tag landing on the front page alongside casualty numbers, and they stop holding the line. That's when Trump's real nightmare begins. Articles of impeachment clear the House of Representatives, abuse of power, violation of Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution.
Yeah, Jake, I mean, this verdict was returned just over 2.5 hours of deliberations. That seemed extremely quick for a jury forum that had a number of questions that they had to answer. And the jury here found that Trump was liable for sexually abusing E. Jean Carroll. That's all related to her story that she says Trump raped her in Bergdorf Goodman department store in the mid-1990s. And they also found that Trump defamed her when he made these statements on October 12th saying that he did not know who Carroll was. He said that her story was a hoax and that she was not his type. Now, over this, there were 7 days of testimony. The jury heard from 11 witnesses that Carroll put on. Trump did not put on a defense, although the jury did see the video deposition of him. And that's something that Carroll's team had argued would cut against him. And it seems that the jury did agree with that and find in that way. And they also awarded Carroll $5 million in damages. Now, as this verdict was read just after 3 p.m. Eastern time today, it was read by the judge's clerk. Carroll was sitting there next in between 2 of her attorneys. She was holding the hands of one of her attorneys. And when the question came of, did they prove that?
The specific charge being that the president launched an enormous, unauthorized offensive military campaign against a sovereign nation absent any congressional authorization whatsoever, no formal declaration of war, no authorization for use of military force, absolutely nothing except executive fiat. The precise constitutional transgression that every legal scholar from the Brennan Center to the American Civil Liberties Union.
E. Jean Carroll proved that Trump had sexually abused her, and the answer was yes. You could see that she looked relieved. She was leaning forward at times. She, exchanged smiles with one of her attorneys. And then the judge had excused the jury after they ran through the verdict, and he polled each and every one of them, 6 men, 3 women. They all said that this was their unanimous verdict. Then Carroll was still in the courtroom, and Trump's attorney, Joe Tacopina, walked over to her, shook her hand. He also shook the hands of her attorneys. It was a very civil trial between both sides. They were both very respectful of each other despite what was on the line. And we saw that continue through this final moment. And then, as you mentioned, Carroll left. We're waiting for her to have a statement based on this verdict. I mean, it was, she says this rape occurred 27 years ago. The jury agreed with her, and it was something she only came public with in 2019. And that lawsuit, that initial lawsuit, is still working its way through the system. She brought this second lawsuit under a new New York law, the Adult Survivors Act, just in November. So, certainly a big moment for her. And
to major journalistic institutions has publicly documented for months. The House transmits the articles to the Senate, and then the Senate arithmetic becomes genuinely fascinating because conviction demands a 2/3 supermajority, 67 votes within a 100-member chamber. With 47 Democrats constituting the baseline, you require 20 Republican senators to cross the aisle.
Her lawyers had said to the jury that they weren't looking for a specific amount of money, that this was really about Carol getting her name back. So that, I imagine we will hear a little bit from Carol about that, something she'd been fighting for. We have not seen Trump's attorney, Joe Tacopina, leave the courthouse just yet. We're waiting to see if he's going to make any statements, if they will move to appeal in this case. I mean, he previously asked for a mistrial. That is standard. That was denied, but I'm sure we'll see some additional moves from them and some, potential legal decisions that were made and allowed by the judge in this case. They may look to challenge them, but a big win for E. Jean Carroll today, a long time coming for her. And as you said, just one of several different lawsuits and investigations that the former president is facing. Jake.
So we should note that the jury had an option to find him liable for rape, and they did not. They did find him liable for sexual abuse and for defamation. Now, he's on Truth Social doing his all caps thing. Maybe I misunderstood. I thought the judge had told him not to do it. Not that under the Constitution that's the right ruling, but I thought the judge had told him not to do that.
20. Within the present polarized environment, that figure sounds utterly fantastical. It sounds like the kind of speculation that gets dismissed as delusional wish fulfillment by Trump's adversaries and derided with contemptuous laughter by his devoted supporters. But let us actually perform the mathematical calculation, because the numbers are substantially closer than casual observation would suggest.
Yeah, so Trump had been posting on Truth Social at the very start of this trial. And, just to back up a moment, the judge made this jury anonymous both to him and to the parties. And the reason he did that, he said, was because of some of the statements Trump has made, even leading up to his indictment in the case brought by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, because some of these statements, were viewed as being, calls for violence, calls for protest. So he wanted to protect the jury and as a result, protect the process here of this trial. So when Trump had made some posts on Truth Social, it was brought to the judge's attention. He warned Trump's attorney, someone should talk to him because he could possibly be violating some statutes here. He didn't get into details there, but, people were talking that this could be, is he suggesting there's jury tampering, witness tampering, anything of just bringing additional attention to this. And Joe Tacopina, Trump's lawyer, said that he did talk to him, and we did see Truth Social posts by Trump stop. He did make those comments in Ireland, but they weren't really raised as an issue in this trial. And the reason why the judge wanted him to stop is he wants to protect the jury, and he wanted to protect the integrity of the trial so they wouldn't end up.
The Senate War Powers vote on the Sanders-Khanna resolution concluded at 47 in favor against 53 opposed. Virtually every Democrat supported the measure. And within that vote, several Republican senators were publicly identified as genuinely conflicted. Rand Paul, who possesses a thoroughly documented record of opposing unauthorized executive military adventurism extending back decades. Lisa Murkowski, who broke with Trump on numerous votes throughout his initial term. Susan Collins, exhibiting the identical pattern of selective independence. Mitt Romney has departed the chamber, but his successor occupies that seat. The libertarian-oriented contingent within the Republican conference, Mike Lee of Utah, who has consistently challenged executive overreach and has been notably vocal regarding war powers limitations. That roster does not yet constitute 20 senators, not remotely, but that roster represents a starting foundation, and starting foundations shift when the political terrain transforms beneath them, when the conflict has persisted for months without any discernible timeline for conclusion, when the $200 billion cost estimate becomes entrenched in public consciousness, when the president himself has already announced his desire to withdraw, when legal defeats accumulate with accelerating frequency, when fractures with international allies become increasingly visible and irreparable, when the Republican brand in competitive states becomes inextricably linked to an unauthorized military campaign consuming genuine resources while generating no coherent victory narrative. The calculation fundamentally changes. Members who would never contemplate breaking with Trump under normal circumstances begin performing the arithmetic regarding what their own electoral campaigns resemble when they must run alongside a second-term president who initiated an illegal conflict, was convicted of abusing constitutional authority, and remains in office solely because the Senate fell short of the supermajority threshold. That is the scenario. That is what keeps the White House consumed with the legal question, consumed with ensuring Johnson maintains discipline, consumed with manufacturing an exit timeline, not because conviction represents an absolute certainty, but because conviction no longer represents an impossibility. And a president who has constructed his entire political existence upon the premise that he remains untouchable, invincible, too formidable to be brought down by any institutional force, now confronts a scenario where the arithmetic is not manifestly stacked in his favor if present trajectories continue their current course. This constitutes Trump's authentic nightmare, not the abstract theoretical possibility of impeachment proceedings, the specific, thoroughly documented, mathematically plausible pathway whereby the Iran conflict becomes the instrument that finally secures his conviction and removal. We shall map the precise route from the present congressional configuration to an actual conviction vote. What must transpire, what must fracture, and how remarkably close the existing vote tallies already stand. We shall examine what a 68 to 32 conviction scenario genuinely requires in terms of Republican defections, and why that numerical requirement is substantially less deranged than it initially sounds. And we shall discuss what conviction would actually signify for Trump personally, for the presidency as an institution, for constitutional governance, and for every future commander-in-chief who studies this historical moment and calculates precisely how far they can push executive authority before the system finally pushes back. Let us map this pathway methodically, step by step, from the present congressional configuration to the scenario that haunts Trump's private reflections. Step 1 involves the House of Representatives, and the House actually represents the less formidable chamber in this equation. The mathematical calculation we have documented throughout this series demonstrates that the bipartisan withdrawal resolution fell short by a margin of 212 votes to 219. 7 votes, within a legislative body comprising 435 members. 7 votes constitutes virtually nothing. 7 votes represents a single adverse news cycle. 7 votes equates to 3 additional allied nations closing their airspace to American operations, or 1 more catastrophic judicial ruling, or 1 additional week of Pentagon testimony confirming no defined endpoint circulating through social media feeds in competitive districts. The members positioned within those 7 votes are not rigid ideologues. They are not progressive Democrats who entered office fundamentally opposing every military engagement. They are not libertarian Republicans like Thomas Massie, who have constructed their entire political identity around constitutional originalism. They are vulnerable incumbents, members representing purple districts, members who secured victory by narrow margins in the most recent election cycle, and who are already consumed with calculations regarding the approaching midterm environment. Members whose constituents are questioning why the nation expends $200 billion on a conflict lacking any discernible conclusion, while their healthcare expenses escalate and their grocery expenditures refuse to decline. For those members, the political calculation does not revolve around abstract constitutional doctrine. It revolves around survival, and the survival equation transforms as the conflict's costs become increasingly visible and its purported benefits become decreasingly defensible. The instant Johnson can no longer cancel the scheduled vote, the moment a privilege resolution compels floor consideration that cannot be procedurally terminated, those 7 members must render a definitive choice. And their choice lies between voting to shield a president who is already publicly discussing withdrawal and whose military campaign lacks any coherent endpoint, or voting alongside a bipartisan coalition and retaining the capacity to inform their constituents that they genuinely attempted to halt this catastrophe. That vote is what produces the articles of impeachment, 2 distinct articles. The first charging Trump with abuse of power, specifically the abuse of commander-in-chief authority, by launching an enormous offensive military campaign, absent congressional authorization, in direct violation of Article 1, Section 8, and the constitutional separation of powers. The second charging violation of the War Powers Resolution, a federal statute duly enacted by Congress and signed into binding law, which Trump has now transgressed by continuing combat operations beyond the 60-day authorization threshold without seeking legislative approval. Two surgically precise, legally specific, exhaustively documented charges. Not obstruction of justice, not procedural criminality, not financial irregularities. The president initiated an illegal war. That constitutes the charge, and the legal foundation supporting that charge is hermetically sealed. The articles proceed to the Senate, and now the more formidable mathematical challenge materializes. 67 votes required for conviction. 47 Democrats representing the baseline. You must secure 20 Republican senators. Let us construct that coalition from the documented evidentiary record. Rand Paul represents the most probable initial Republican affirmative vote. Paul possesses a career spanning 2 decades of opposing unauthorized executive military adventurism that predates Trump's political existence entirely. He opposed the Iraq War authorization. He opposed military interventions in Libya and Syria during the previous administration. He has personally introduced war powers legislation. He voted affirmatively for the Sanders-Khanna War Powers Resolution concerning Iran. His vote on a conviction article charging violation of the War Powers Resolution does not constitute a departure from his established principles. It constitutes the faithful application of those principles. Paul has maintained consistency on this fundamental question when virtually no other Republican senator has managed to do so. He votes affirmatively on conviction. That delivers vote number 48. Mike Lee of Utah represents the second most probable affirmative vote. Lee is a constitutional attorney by professional training and a self-identified constitutional conservative. His entire political identity rests upon the conviction that the Constitution means precisely what its text communicates, that the federal government, including the executive branch, must operate strictly within its constitutionally prescribed boundaries. He has been notably vocal regarding war powers limitations. He co-sponsored the original War Powers Resolution that Rand Paul advanced during the initial phases of the Iran conflict. An impeachment article charging constitutional transgression of war powers authority is precisely the category of case that Lee's publicly articulated principles compel him to endorse. Vote number 49. Lisa Murkowski of Alaska has broken with Trump more consistently than any other Republican senator currently occupying a seat in the chamber. She voted to convict during the second impeachment trial concerning January 6th. She has repeatedly distinguished between partisan allegiance and constitutional obligation. She represents a state where federal expenditure and military operations carry direct and immediate consequences. A $200 billion unauthorized conflict lacking any defined endpoint does not enjoy popularity among Alaskan fiscal conservatives. She possesses no political future contingent upon Trump's approval. She survived a Trump-endorsed primary challenge by prevailing through ranked choice voting mechanisms. Murkowski votes affirmatively. Vote number 50. Susan Collins of Maine exhibits a comparable pattern. Voted to convict during the second impeachment. Has consistently positioned herself as the reasonable Republican willing to separate from party consensus on constitutional questions. Maine constitutes a purple state containing a congressional district that supported the Democratic candidate in the previous presidential cycle. Collins calculates that her survival in the approaching election cycle, should she seek another term, depends more substantially upon being the Republican who defended constitutional governance than upon being the Republican who shielded an unauthorized military campaign. Vote number 51. That delivers 4 Republican votes. You require 20. So, from where do the remaining 16 originate? This is precisely where the political environment accomplishes what principled conviction alone cannot achieve. The scenario demands a specific constellation of conditions that compound one another progressively over time. The conflict persists beyond any juncture where a credible assertion of victory remains sustainable. Trump has already announced his desire to withdraw within a matter of weeks. If that withdrawal materializes absent any ceasefire agreement, absent any regime transformation, absent verifiable elimination of nuclear capabilities, absent any of the stated strategic objectives, and the Pentagon continues continues holding a $200 billion invoice, the conflict's political liability crystallizes into permanent form. Every Republican senator competing in a contested state during the approaching midterm cycle is now tethered to that invoice, to those casualties, to that legal determination, to an exit that cannot be characterized as victory through any intellectually honest framework. Prediction markets and polling data shift directionally. The research documentation notes that betting markets had already commenced pricing in escalating impeachment exposure connected to the Iran conflict. When prediction markets move, financial contributors take notice. When financial contributors take notice, senators take notice. When senators representing competitive states begin observing internal polling demonstrating their approval ratings deteriorating among independent voters due to the conflict, the calculation transforms. Not because they experience a sudden conversion to constitutional principle, because they believe in political self-preservation. The legal foundation continues accumulating reinforcing weight. Every additional week of combat operations extending beyond the 60-day War Powers Resolution deadline constitutes an additional week of documented federal statutory violation. Every supplementary legal analysis from the Brennan Center, the American Civil Liberties Union, law school faculties spanning the nation adds further substance to an evidentiary record that conviction defense arguments cannot successfully refute. The charge is not complicated. The war was initiated absent authorization. The War Powers Resolution was transgressed. The constitutional provision is explicit. Mounting a defense against that charge necessitates arguing that the Constitution does not genuinely mean what its plain text communicates, which is an argument that constitutional conservatives serving in the Senate cannot advance without annihilating their own political identity. And most critically, the House vote generates its own forward momentum. The instant articles of impeachment clear the House of Representatives with bipartisan endorsement. The political atmosphere within the Senate undergoes fundamental transformation. It ceases to be a hypothetical abstraction. It is no longer a protest resolution or a procedural war powers measure. It constitutes a formal impeachment with articles that have successfully passed one chamber of Congress. Every senator must now determine whether they wish to be recorded as the individual who voted to acquit a president whom the House has formally found responsible for initiating an unconstitutional war. That is an entirely different question than whether to support a war powers resolution. It carries fundamentally different political gravity and fundamentally different historical significance. Senators who would never have cast an affirmative vote for the Sanders-Khanna resolution begin calculating what their historical legacy will communicate. Senators who privately articulated the Vietnam comparison within closed caucus deliberations must now determine whether the historical record will identify them as individuals who possessed knowledge and elected to take no action. And senators representing states that Trump carried, but that contain substantial independent voter populations, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, begin performing the competitive state arithmetic with genuine polling data positioned directly before them. Progressing from 4 documented probable votes to 20 requires approximately 16 additional senators arriving at that survival calculation concurrently. It demands that the political environment has deteriorated sufficiently that the personal political cost of acquittal exceeds the personal political cost of conviction. It demands that adequate Republican senators conclude that their electoral prospects are better advanced by positioning themselves on the correct side of a constitutional crisis than by being identified as the individuals who permitted an unauthorized $200 billion war to proceed entirely unpunished. That represents a substantially elevated threshold. It may not be successfully cleared. The Republican conference's tribal allegiance to Trump has survived developments that previous political analysts asserted would certainly shatter it, but it has never been tested by this specific combination of factors: an unauthorized military campaign, a thoroughly documented statutory violation, a $200 billion financial obligation, a president announcing his own withdrawal absent any coherent victory narrative, and a House impeachment that formally places the question before the Senate for definitive resolution. The scenario is not inevitable, but it is not fantastical either. It constitutes the mathematically plausible outcome of a set of conditions that are presently in active motion, and that is precisely what renders it Trump's authentic nightmare. Not the certainty of conviction, the genuine possibility of conviction, the recognition that the arithmetic exists, that the pathway is authentic, that every week the conflict continues, every legal defeat that accumulates, every international partner that distances itself, every Republican senator who privately articulates the Vietnam comparison represents one additional step toward the vote he has insisted will never materialize. Let us distill this into its essential components. This is the scenario that haunts Trump's consciousness, not because conviction is assured, because the pathway to conviction is genuine, thoroughly documented, and contracting in length with each passing week. It originates in the House of Representatives. The bipartisan withdrawal resolution fell short by a margin of 212 to 219, 7 votes, 7 members representing purple districts who campaigned on fiscal discipline and constitutional governance, and who voted to shield a president already declaring his intention to exit a conflict, lacking any defined endpoint while carrying a $200 billion financial obligation. Those 7 members are not rigid ideologues. They are survivors. And the survival equation transforms when Johnson exhausts his capacity to cancel scheduled votes, and floor consideration occurs, and those members must render a definitive choice on the permanent record. Articles of impeachment successfully pass. 2 charges: abuse of power for initiating an enormous, unauthorized, offensive military campaign in violation of Article 1, Section 8. Violation of the War Powers Resolution, a federal statute, by continuing combat operations beyond the 60-day authorization threshold absent congressional approval. Surgically precise, legally specific, hermetically sealed charges supported by unanimous consensus within the constitutional law community, the Brennan Center, the American Civil Liberties Union, major journalistic institutions, law faculties spanning the nation, all pointing toward identical constitutional text and arriving at identical conclusions. The charge essentially writes itself. The articles proceed to the Senate. 67 votes required for conviction. 47 Democrats as baseline. 20 Republicans necessary. Rand Paul votes affirmatively. His entire political career has been constructed upon opposition to unauthorized executive military adventurism. He voted for the Sanders-Khanna War Powers Resolution. Conviction on a war powers violation charge constitutes the faithful application of his stated principles, not a departure from them. Vote 48. Mike Lee votes affirmatively. Constitutional attorney by professional formation. Constitutional conservative by political identity, co-sponsor of war powers legislation concerning the Iran conflict. An impeachment article charging constitutional transgression is the case his own political identity compels him to endorse. Vote 49. Lisa Murkowski votes affirmatively. Voted to convict during the second impeachment. Possesses no political future contingent upon Trump's approval. Survived a Trump-endorsed primary challenge without his assistance. Calculates her historical legacy and her remaining political influence based upon being the Republican who defended the Constitution when defense genuinely mattered. Vote 50. Susan Collins votes affirmatively. Identical pattern. Voted to convict during the second impeachment. Maine is purple. Her survival depends more substantially upon the reasonable Republican identity than upon shielding an unauthorized $200 billion conflict. Vote 51. That delivers 4. 16 additional votes required. And this is where the political environment performs the necessary work. The conflict persists beyond any credible assertion of victory. Trump withdraws absent achieving stated objectives. The $200 billion invoice is permanently recorded. Every Republican senator competing in a contested state is tethered to that invoice. Polling among independent voters declines. Financial contributors take notice. Senators take notice. Betting markets, which research documentation notes had already commenced pricing in escalating impeachment exposure, continue moving directionally. The internal conference dynamic shifts as member after member privately articulates the Vietnam comparison and must publicly determine what they are willing to defend. The House vote generates its own momentum within the Senate. It ceases to be hypothetical abstraction. It constitutes formal impeachment with bipartisan House endorsement. Every senator must now answer the definitive question on the permanent record. Do you convict the president whom the House has found responsible for initiating an unconstitutional war? That is is a fundamentally different question than supporting a procedural resolution. It carries historical significance. It demands that senators determine what they desire their legacy to communicate. Senators in Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, states Trump carried or nearly carried, but which contains substantial independent voter populations, begin observing internal polling that renders the calculation concrete and unavoidable. The tribal allegiance to Trump that has withstood everything is now being tested by a specific combination it has never previously confronted: an unauthorized military campaign, a thoroughly documented violation of federal statute, a $200 billion financial obligation, a president who declared his own withdrawal absent any victory, and a formal Senate trial that permanently records every individual vote. The scenario does not demand that all 16 remaining votes originate from principled constitutional conservatives. It demands that sufficient numbers conclude that their personal political survival is better advanced through conviction than through acquittal. That is a clinical calculation, not an idealistic aspiration. And clinical calculations transform when the political environment transforms. What conviction signifies, if it materializes, extends far beyond Trump individually. For the inaugural instance in American constitutional history, a president would have been convicted by the Senate for exceeding constitutional limitations on war powers authority. That is not merely accountability for a single individual. That constitutes binding precedent. Every future president who contemplates initiating an offensive military campaign, absent congressional authorization, must now factor against the documented precedent that such conduct can culminate in Senate conviction. Every future speaker who contemplates canceling votes to shield a president's unauthorized conflict must now evaluate whether that protection will successfully extend all the way to 67 votes. The constitutional constraint that the founders embedded that Congress must authorize war becomes genuinely operative in a manner it has not been throughout the modern era. That is the nightmare scenario, not merely removal from office. The termination of the premise that a president can initiate an enormous, unauthorized military campaign, assert victory, and depart without confronting any institutional consequence. The termination of the precedent that executive war powers authority is effectively limitless, provided the Speaker cancels the correct votes and adequate senators maintain discipline. Trump has conducted his entire second term operating upon the assumption that the system will shield him in the identical manner it shielded him previously, that Johnson will maintain control of the House, that adequate Republicans will maintain control of the Senate, that the legal determination carries no genuine weight because the political fortification holds firm. The nightmare is the fortification collapsing. 7 House members performing the arithmetic. 4 documented Senate votes becoming 16, becoming 20. The 60-day clock exhausting itself. The $200 billion invoice arriving for payment. The exit absent victory confirming there existed nothing worth protecting. And the Senate determining that 67 votes is not an impossibility after all. That is what Trump genuinely fears, not the attorneys, the mathematics.